he found two Apache sisters at his gate. Their chief's answer turned the ranch into a refuge. The sun was merciless that afternoon, burning the dust into a pale haze that shimmered along the fence line of the Quinn ranch. Eli Quinn wiped the sweat from his brow. He was heading back to the barn. And that was when he froze mid-stride, because two Apache girls, one about 12, the other no more than 8, were standing at his gate with their hands clasped together so tightly their knuckles had gone white, their dark braids limp from heat and travel, their eyes wide with the kind of fear that comes only from running longer than a child ever should. The older one lifted her chin in a way that tried to be brave, but trembled at the edges, and Eli saw her swallow hard before whispering something soft in Apache to the younger girl, who pressed herself closer as though the words might shield her. They weren't trespassing. They weren't begging. They were simply there, as if the world had pushed them to his doorstep and given them nowhere else left to stand. He stepped closer, slowly, careful not to spook them, boots scuffing softly in the dust, and when he reached the gate, he noticed what their small bodies tried to hide. The faint streaks of smoke on their clothes, a torn sleeve, and a bruise blooming across the younger girl's cheek, the kind that made the back of his throat tighten so sharply he had to exhale through his teeth to steady himself. The older sister lifted her hand. Not high, not bold, just enough that it shook in the air between them, and pointed to the canyon trail behind her, then to her chest, then to her little sister, and finally to the earth as if to say, "We had to leave." Eli didn't speak right away, not because he didn't know what to say, but because he understood too well the danger of saying the wrong thing to children already on the edge of flight. He rested one hand gently on the top rail and lowered his posture, letting his height shrink into something less threatening, and the younger girl peeked at him from behind her sister's shoulder, with eyes so full of exhaustion he felt it like a blow. A dry gust kicked a cloud of dust around them, stinging the air, and the older sister blinked hard as if fighting tears she refused to let fall in front of a stranger. But then, very quietly, as though it cost her something, she said in broken English, "We need safe." The words were barely sound, more breath than voice, but they hit Eli straight in the chest with a force he couldn't pretend away. He opened the gate slowly, making sure the hinges didn't screech, and stepped aside in a gesture as old as kindness itself, not touching them, not urging them, only offering the space for them to enter if they chose. For a long moment neither girl moved, their small bodies pulled tight with instinct and uncertainty, but the younger one finally took a trembling step forward when she saw that Eli hadn't raised his voice, hadn't drawn a weapon, hadn't even reached for her. He had simply waited. The older sister placed a hand gently on the little one's back, guiding her forward with the silent bravery of someone far too young to play protector, and they crossed the threshold of the gate together, their shadows merging on the dust like a single shape. Eli didn't smile, didn't speak, didn't ask questions. He just nodded once, slow and steady, letting them see that whatever chased them here wouldn't find loudness or anger on this land, only a man who would stand between them and the next storm, if that was what the day required. And as the ranch quieted around them, holding its breath in the burning heat, Eli understood one truth with absolute clarity. Whatever came next, his land was no longer meant for one man alone. Eli led the girls toward the porch with slow, steady steps, keeping a respectful distance so they wouldn't feel cornered by his size or the unfamiliar quiet of the ranch. The older girl stayed alert. The younger clung to her sleeve, and every few paces they both glanced behind them as if expecting someone, or something, to burst from the canyon trail and drag them back into whatever fear had carved those shadows beneath their eyes, making Eli's jaw tighten with a protective instinct he didn't fully understand yet. When they reached the porch steps, he paused and crouched down so his height no longer rose over them like a wall, his forearms resting loosely on his knees, his posture low and gentle, and he nodded toward the water bucket by the door, letting them know it was theirs for the taking without demanding they step any closer than they wished. The younger girl looked to her sister first, the silent question clear, and the older one nodded with a small, encouraging motion. Only then did the little one approach, fingers trembling as she dipped the tin ladle into the cool water and took a sip so cautious it barely wet her lips. Then another, a bit steadier, and finally a long drink that made her shoulders sag with relief, so sudden it nearly unbalanced her. Eli watched the girl's throat work as she swallowed, and something inside him settled. A deep, quiet certainty that whatever else these girls carried, thirst should not be one of their burdens anymore. The older sister stepped forward next, taking her own drink with hands that tried so hard not to shake, but couldn't hide the exhaustion any longer, and she wiped her mouth with the back of her hand in a quick, almost embarrassed motion that reminded Eli just how hard she'd been fighting to stay composed. He motioned toward the shade beneath the porch roof, offering them a place to sit where the heat wouldn't burn their skin. But the older girl hesitated, her body frozen between mistrust and need, until Eli stepped back a few feet and rested one hand on the porch post, letting her see he wasn't trying to box her in. She studied him for a long moment, eyes dark and sharp with caution, then guided her little sister to sit on the steps with movements filled with both fear and fierce protectiveness. Eli sat too, but far enough away that he couldn't reach them even if he tried, his boots planted in the dirt, his hands loose between his knees, his gaze not on them but on the horizon, giving them the safety of being near without being watched. The wind shifted, lifting strands of their braids and carrying with it a faint smell of smoke that made the older girl stiffen violently, her fingers clenching the wood of the step until her knuckles went white, and Eli didn't need translation to understand that whatever they'd run from still lived in their minds like a fresh flame. He lowered his breath, softened his posture, and let his voice come out quiet when he finally spoke. "No one's coming through that gate unless I say so." The words were simple, steady, unadorned, and the older girl looked at him with disbelief first, then with something close to recognition, as though she was trying to decide whether a man she'd known for less than an hour could truly be a barrier between them and harm. The younger sister leaned into her, head on her arm, eyelids drooping from exhaustion she could no longer hide. And Eli looked away again, not in avoidance but in respect, because moments like this weren't meant to be stared at. They were meant to be protected. As the last edge of sunlight slid behind the barn, turning the ranch into a haven of soft orange and long shadows, Eli exhaled slowly, knowing one thing for certain. He hadn't just found 2 children at his gate. He had found responsibility, history, fear, hope, and the fragile beginnings of a story that would ask more of him than any season of ranch work ever had. Night settled slowly over the ranch, turning the sky a deep blue that softened the hard edges of the day as Eli lit the lamp inside the house and let its warm glow spill across the porch, inviting without insisting. The older girl stayed rigid. The younger leaned sleepily against her side. And Eli understood they weren't ready to step inside a stranger's home, so he moved the lamp to the windowsill instead, angled just enough that its light reached them without pulling them closer than they wished. Then he sat down on the porch planks a good 6 feet away, letting his boots dangle off the edge like he was settling into his usual evening, rather than trying to manage theirs. The wind eased into a gentle breeze, brushing dust from the air, and the girls watched the lamplight flicker with wary eyes until the younger one blinked slowly, fighting sleep, her head bobbing forward in small jerks. Eli pretended he didn't notice, though his chest tightened at how young she looked when fatigue stripped away her fear. He didn't speak, didn't ask questions, didn't even clear his throat, aware that noise could feel like intrusion to children used to bracing for the next loud thing. So instead, he reached to the side and quietly dragged a folded quilt across the porch toward them, inch by inch, never crossing the invisible boundary their bodies had drawn around themselves, leaving it halfway between them like an offering placed on neutral ground. The older sister stared at the quilt, eyes narrowing with calculation, her breath catching as if she feared a trap where none existed. But when the wind picked up again and the younger girl shivered, she slid the quilt closer with one cautious finger, her movement stiff but purposeful. She wrapped it around her sister first, tucking the corners beneath the child's legs with a care that struck Eli like a blow, then draped a sliver over her own shoulders as if too much warmth would feel like too much trust. Eli folded his hands loosely on his lap, gaze fixed on the yard rather than on them, and the older girl watched him in the lamplight, studying the slope of his shoulders, the stillness of his jaw, the absence of threat in the way he breathed. Trust didn't arrive, but suspicion loosened one small thread. The younger sister murmured something in Apache, her voice thick with sleep, and the older one answered softly, brushing a gentle hand over her hair before looking back at Eli with a flicker of something new. Maybe gratitude, maybe curiosity, or maybe just the quiet recognition that he wasn't reaching for them. He shifted his weight and pointed once toward the doorway, then shook his head slowly, making it clear he wasn't expecting them to come inside, and the older sister's shoulders dropped a fraction, as if a knot had loosened in her chest. They sat that way for a long, quiet stretch, two children wrapped in a borrowed quilt and a cowboy sitting in the half-light. No talking, no demands, only small breaths warming the cooling air. Eventually, the younger girl drifted fully asleep, her head slipping into her sister's lap, and the older one looked at Eli again with eyes that asked something unspoken. Will it stay safe here through the night? Eli answered without words. He rose slowly, walked to the gate, and closed it with careful hands, sliding the latch into place with a soft click that sounded more like a promise than a lock, then returned to the porch and resumed his seat without a single glance at them, offering presence without pressure. And as the lamp flickered behind the window and the stars rose one by one above the quiet ranch, the older girl finally let her body lean back against the porch post, the tiniest surrender in a long day of fear, trusting, for the first time since morning, that someone else would listen to the dark so she and her sister didn't have to. Eli didn't sleep much that night, though he stayed inside long enough to give the girls privacy, listening for every shift of wind and every distant sound that might unsettle children already stretched thin by fear. The ranch stayed quiet. The girls barely moved. And when dawn finally crept over the ridge, warm and pale, Eli stepped onto the porch with slow, measured steps so the boards wouldn't groan beneath him, carrying 2 tin cups of warm tea he'd brewed from the last of his dried leaves. Not because he expected them to drink it, but because he wanted them to know kindness came at the start of the day, not just when fear made it necessary. The older sister tensed the moment he appeared, her arm tightening protectively around the younger girl. But she didn't bolt or rise. Instead, she watched him closely as he set the cups several feet away on the porch, where the morning sun would warm them naturally, then stepped back again, settling on the opposite side of the door frame with his elbows resting loosely on his knees. The younger sister blinked awake, startled by the new light, and when she saw Eli, she froze for a moment before remembering the quilt and her sister and the quiet night that hadn't hurt them, and her little body relaxed into the steps with a soft, tired exhale. The older girl brushed a strand of hair from the child's forehead before offering her a small smile, thin and unsure but real. Eli nodded once, a silent good morning. And the older sister surprised him by giving the smallest nod back, barely a tilt of her chin. But in that gesture lived a shift so delicate he almost missed it. Acknowledgement without acceptance, recognition without surrender. She eyed the tea suspiciously at first, leaning forward to sniff the steam as though expecting trickery. But when the scent turned out warm and gentle rather than strange or bitter, she took the cup and handed it to her sister before selecting the other for herself, holding it tightly with both hands so he wouldn't see how cold her fingers still were. Eli stayed quiet, letting them drink in peace. But when the wind lifted suddenly and blew a gust of dust towards them, the older sister flinched hard, her shoulders curling around the younger girl instinctively. Eli's hand twitched toward the quilt on reflex, wanting to shield them, but he caught himself just in time, lowering it slowly and letting the moment settle instead of smothering it. The older girl noticed his restraint, noticed the help he didn't force, and her breathing steadied a little, long enough for her to take a second sip without shaking. Birds called from the cottonwood tree by the gate, the kind of soft morning song that usually eased Eli into the day, and he let the sound work between them now, bridging the space without stepping into it. After a few minutes, the younger girl pointed at the birds with a spark of quiet wonder, whispering something in Apache that Elias didn't understand but felt all the same, and the older sister nodded with a tenderness that cut through the hardness of the night they'd survived. Eli rose slowly to check the fire pit, giving them space again. But the moment he took a step toward the yard, the older girl stiffened sharply, as if movement meant danger, and Eli paused, frozen mid-stride, then deliberately lowered himself onto a hay bale in full view where the morning light softened everything it touched, making sure she saw each careful choice he made. She blinked at him, uncertainty flickering over her features, but she didn't pull her sister back inside the blanket. Instead, she watched him with eyes that asked a question she didn't trust her tongue to form yet. Are you safe every hour, or only at night? Eli didn't speak an answer. He simply sat there, shoulders relaxed, posture open, offering stillness instead of reassurance. And as the morning sun rose fully over the ranch, warming the dust and softening the long shadows they carried with them, the older girl finally let her sister finish her tea without clutching her in fear, because nothing about Eli Quinn had changed overnight, except the girl's belief that maybe quiet men could be safe at dawn, too. By late morning, a cold wind swept down from the ridge, carrying the smell of rain and turning the warm dawn into something sharp enough to make both girls shiver beneath the quilt. And Eli knew they wouldn't last long on the porch if the weather turned. He hesitated only a moment. He weighed their fear. And then he moved with slow, deliberate care, retrieving an armful of firewood and setting it beside the outdoor stove he rarely used except in storms, striking a match and coaxing a small flame to life so the girls could warm their hands without stepping inside the unfamiliar house. The older sister watched every movement, eyes narrowed, shoulders tense, as if expecting each flick of the flame to reveal an ulterior motive. But Eli kept his posture open and unhurried, lighting the stove with the quiet certainty of a man who wanted nothing from them other than to see their fingers stop trembling. He pulled a battered pot from the hook and filled it with water from the barrel, placing it over the rising heat, and then added dried beans, strips of smoked venison, and the last of the herbs he'd been saving for winter. Not because it was special, but because he knew hunger wore children down faster than fear. The scent drifted upward in a warm, earthy trail that made the younger girl lift her head from the older sister's lap, her eyes softening with a curiosity that had been beaten down too many times recently. Eli didn't turn toward her. He didn't encourage her. He simply stirred the pot with slow, steady motions, letting the smell of food do what words couldn't. When he tasted the broth and adjusted the seasoning with a pinch of salt, The older sister's throat bobbed in a swallow she tried to hide, her pride wrestling with the obvious truth that they hadn't eaten properly in days. He reached for 2 tin bowls, placed them on the porch steps, and retreated to the hay bale again, his boots scuffing the dirt in a soft pattern that left them space to choose on their own terms. The younger girl glanced up at her sister with pleading eyes, and the older one held out a hand, not to take the food yet, but to stop her sister from rushing forward too fast, reminding Eli in that gesture just how much danger they had run from, and how hard it was for the older child to trust anything that looked too kind. The rain clouds thickened overhead, rumbling faintly, and Eli sensed the girls needed warmth more than caution, so he rose and fetched one more item, a clean cloth soaked in warm water from the stove, and placed it near the bowls, not saying a word, simply laying it down so the older sister could tend to the bruise on the younger girl's cheek if she wished. That was the moment something shifted. The older girl's eyes flickered from the cloth to Eli's face, confusion merging with unsteady gratitude, as though she had expected food or shelter, but not the quiet respect of letting her be the one to care for her sister. She reached for the cloth first, pressing it gently to the younger girl's cheek, and only after that did she lift one of the bowls and offer it to her, her voice trembling through a soft phrase of encouragement in Apache. The little one took the first bite slowly, tasting, testing, then relaxed into it with a small, relieved hum that made Eli exhale a breath he'd been holding unknowingly. When the older sister finally took her own bowl, she ate with quick, efficient bites, still watching Eli from the corner of her eye, still ready to spring if he moved wrong. But her shoulders loosened a fraction with each spoonful, the warmth from the stove settling into her bones as the wind howled and the first drops of rain tapped gently against the porch rail. Eli sat nearby, letting the storm gather around them as he added another piece of wood to the fire, and as the rain thickened into a steady fall that wrapped the ranch in a curtain of sound, the older girl looked toward him with something that wasn't trust yet, but wasn't fear either. And in that fragile space between the two, Eli understood he had been given the smallest piece of ground to build something steady on if he didn't break it. The storm rolled through faster than Eli expected, leaving behind a washed clean sky and a faint chill that settled over the ranch like a reminder of everything the girls had endured before reaching his gate. The rain eased, the wind calmed, and the world felt strangely quiet in a way that made the youngest girl lean closer to her sister, as if silence itself could be dangerous after so many nights, where it never meant safety. Eli didn't speak as he gathered the now empty bowls and rinsed them at the pump, each movement slow and steady, the clink of tin against water the only sound in the air. He didn't look at the girls while he worked, letting them stay invisible for a moment, giving them space to breathe without feeling watched. When he set the bowls aside to dry, he walked to the barn with the easy pace of a man checking on chores he'd been doing his entire life. But he left the barn door open wide, the lamplight inside stretching a soft, golden path across the wet ground. A silent invitation. Nothing more. The older girl noticed first, her eyes following the light into the warm, hay-scented shadows, and Eli saw the internal battle flicker across her face. Fear on one side, the memory of too many cold nights on the other, and the little sister tugging gently at her sleeve with a sleepy whimper that broke through the older child's thin shield of caution. Eli didn't gesture for them to come. He didn't wave or coax. He simply leaned against the barn wall, arms loose at his sides, gaze turned toward the pasture, as though he were admiring the way the moonlight touched the wet grass. The older girl studied him for a long moment, waiting to see if he'd push, but he stayed still, steady, silent, letting her choose for herself. Finally, she rose and wrapped the quilt around her sister before guiding her toward the barn with careful, hesitant steps, pausing every few feet to check if Eli's posture changed. It didn't, not once, and that seemed to matter. Inside, the barn glowed warm from a single lantern hung high enough to cast soft light without blinding them, and Eli stepped far aside to give them room to settle in the hay before he took a seat on an overturned crate halfway between them and the open door. The younger girl curled instantly into the hay, exhaustion pulling her under so quickly it made Eli's chest ache, while the older one stayed upright, watching him with a mixture of vigilance and gradual, reluctant ease, her fingers slowly unknotting as she realized he wasn't coming closer. A breath of wind drifted through the open door, stirring loose strands of her braid, and without thinking, she reached to shield her sister from the draft. Eli noticed the gesture, stood slowly, and crossed to the door, not toward them, and pushed it nearly closed so the night air wouldn't reach the sleeping child. The older sister didn't expect it. She stiffened at first, but when she realized he wasn't trapping them, he'd left a gap, just wide enough that she could run if she needed. Her shoulders eased with a quiet, fragile exhale that felt like a decision she hadn't meant to make. For several long minutes they stayed in that half-lit quiet, the older girl watching him, Eli watching nothing at all, and the younger girl breathing in soft, rhythmic pulses that softened the whole barn. Then something small happened. Something easy to miss, unless one had been waiting for it. The older sister reached down, picked up a handful of hay, and gently covered her sister's feet with it to keep her warm. And when she looked up again, she didn't look at the floor or the lantern or the shadows. She looked directly at Eli for the first time without fear. He didn't smile or nod or speak. He simply returned the glance with a calm, steady presence that said, without sound, "I'll keep watch while you sleep." And as the moon climbed higher over the wet pastures and the lantern flickered low, the older girl finally allowed her body to sink into the hay beside her sister, eyes still on Eli, but no longer searching for danger, just measuring the quiet of a man who had not broken any of his unspoken promises. Eli didn't remember drifting asleep on the crate, only waking to the faintest scrape of hooves somewhere beyond the barn, and the older girl sitting bolt upright in the hay, eyes wide, hand instantly covering her sister's mouth as if danger were a habit her body responded to before her mind could. The barn was dim. The night was cold. And Eli lifted a steady hand, palm outward, signaling her to stay where she was, while he rose with slow, deliberate movements that wouldn't startle either the girls or whoever had entered the yard. He stepped toward the cracked barn door, his boots silent on the packed dirt, and peered through the sliver of space left open for their comfort, spotting the faint outline of two riders on the far edge of the property, silhouettes in the pre-dawn blue light, moving in cautious arcs as though searching for tracks rather than expecting trouble. Eli's chest tightened. His mind raced. And he knew instantly that these weren't outlaws or ranch hands or neighbors looking to borrow tools. They were Apache scouts, men sent to find the children who'd vanished into the canyon trails. He didn't open the door wider. He didn't call out. Instead, he stepped back and turned his face toward the older girl, who was watching him with a terror so raw it nearly hollowed him out, and he shook his head once in a gentle, grounding gesture meant to say, "Not danger, not yet." She didn't fully believe him, not with her sister whimpering softly against her shoulder, but she stayed still, frozen between hope and dread, her breath shallow as she pressed the quilt tighter around the little one's trembling body. Eli didn't touch her. He didn't approach. He simply crouched where he was and pointed two fingers toward the scouts, then tapped the barn floor twice, then raised both hands slightly and opened them. 3 gestures in a simple, clumsy attempt to communicate something like, "They're looking. You're safe here." The older sister's eyes softened at the edges, just barely, because even if she didn't understand every motion, she understood that he wasn't preparing to hand them over. Outside, a distant whistle, soft, low, intentional, cut through the morning air, and the horses shifted in response before the riders faded into the fogged horizon where the pasture met the trail. The sound wasn't hostile, but it was searching, a signal meant for someone who hadn't answered. Eli let out a breath he'd been holding too tight, the relief small but real. And then he turned back toward the girls and held out one hand, not to take them, not to move them, but showing his empty palm the way a man might show he carried no weapon and no ill intent. The older girl watched him for a long, trembling moment, weighing every second, and then, in a gesture that reshaped the air between them, she reached out one hand of her own and placed it inside his, not in trust, not yet, but in choice. It was the quietest acceptance he had ever received. It was the loudest sound in the barn. He gripped her hand with the lightest pressure imaginable, a barely there warmth meant only to steady, then released her as gently as he'd taken her, and she blinked as though she couldn't believe she had decided to bridge that distance for even a heartbeat. The youngest sister stirred, rubbing her eyes, whispering something sleepy and confused, and the older girl smoothed her hair with a tenderness born of too many nights spent protecting rather than resting, her voice softening like dawn itself. Outside, the first strip of sunlight broke through the clouds and cast a pale line across the barn floor, cutting through the quiet like a promise waiting to be spoken. Eli stood slowly, meeting the older child's cautious gaze with one steady truth. Whatever happened when the Apache returned, they wouldn't face it alone, not while they were on his land. And in that fragile morning hush, with fear still clinging to the walls but hope warming the hay beneath them, a shift happened so quietly it almost went unnoticed. The ranch was no longer a place they were hiding in. It was becoming a place they belonged. The sun had barely risen when the tension finally reached the ranch, carried not by riders this time, but by the uneasy silence that wrapped itself around the yard as Eli stepped outside and saw 3 men approaching from the road. 2 ranchers he recognized from town, and one stranger who sat tall in the saddle, his expression carved sharp as stone, his gaze fixed on the barn with a certainty that made Eli's pulse hammer once against his ribs. The horses slowed, dust lifted, and the older Apache sister, peering through the narrow slat in the barn wall, gripped her younger sibling's hand with a strength born from nights spent running, her breath catching the second she recognized the stranger's braids, the paint on his cheek, the hard-won authority in his posture. He was not a raider, not a scout, not a man out for vengeance. He was their chief, the one whose word shaped the shape of every decision their people made. Eli stepped forward before the men could reach the porch, boots firm on the wet ground, shoulders squared in a posture that wasn't pride, but protection, though he didn't raise his voice or his hands or his stance. He simply planted himself between the barn and the approaching riders, the wind tugging at his shirt as the stranger halted in front of him with eyes that missed nothing. The chief looked past Eli at first, scanning the yard, scanning the mountains, scanning the spaces where children might hide. But when his gaze returned to Eli, something like question, quiet, powerful, unspoken, hung between them. Eli answered without words. He lifted one hand, palm open, then lowered it slowly toward the ground in a gesture that said, "They're here. They're safe." The chief exhaled through his nose, long and steady, and the 2 ranchers beside him exchanged uneasy glances, shifting in their saddles as if they weren't sure whether they were meant to prepare for conflict or conversation. Eli didn't give them a chance to decide. He took one step closer, calm and deliberate, and said quietly, "They came to my gate. They were cold. They were scared. They hurt no one." The men bristled, muttering about stolen horses, burned fences, and old grudges that stretched longer than any of their memories. But the chief silenced them with one flick of his hand, his gaze locked wholly on Eli now, measuring the cowboy's posture, his stillness, the steadiness in his voice. Then the barn door creaked softly, and the older girl stepped into view behind Eli, her little sister clutching her braided sleeve, her chin trembling but raised all the same. The chief's face shifted, not softening but deepening, carrying both relief and sorrow in a single breath as he stepped down from his horse and walked toward them with the gravity of a man who had spent 2 nights scouring the wilds for signs of children he feared he'd never see again. The older girl tensed as he approached, her body torn between running to him and running from him. But he stopped several paces away, lowering himself slowly to one knee, not to claim her, not to command her, but to show her the respect of meeting her on her level after the fear she had endured. Eli watched her chest rise and fall in sharp, uneven breaths, saw the conflict playing out behind her eyes, and steeled himself in case she stepped back. But she didn't. She let her little sister approach first, the smaller child stumbling into the chief's arms with a sob that broke the morning wide open. The chief wrapped her gently, whispering something in Apache that carried the weight of apology, and only then did he turn to the older sister, placing a hand over his heart in a gesture of gratitude so deep it needed no translation. The ranchers behind him shifted uneasily again, muttering about trespass and debts and the way things used to be, but the chief straightened slowly, still holding his youngest charge, and said in accented but steady English, "Your land was a refuge. My people do not forget this." Eli didn't answer right away. He didn't know how to stand in the middle of a moment that felt bigger than fences and feuds and the dusty grief of past years, but he nodded slowly, and the chief nodded back, a quiet agreement forming between them that turned the morning wind into something alive, with possibility. The older girl stepped closer to Eli then, just close enough that her shoulder brushed his arm for the first time, not seeking protection now but acknowledging it. And when the chief saw that small trust take root between them, his face settled into something like respect. And in that stillness, Apache chief, ranchers, cowboy, 2 exhausted girls, Eli realized the ranch wasn't just shelter anymore. Today, it had become a place where old battles paused, where new truths stood, and where a man like him could choose to turn strangers into family if the world would give him the chance to try. The morning light grew warmer as the tension slowly drained from the yard, leaving behind the quiet aftermath of fear giving way to understanding. And Eli stood very still, while the older Apache girl kept her shoulder lightly against his arm, the contact so small it might have gone unnoticed if it hadn't meant everything after the nights she'd spent flinching at shadows. The chief shifted the younger girl in his arms, the ranchers muttered. And the entire ranch seemed to hold its breath as the older sister stepped forward with a hesitance that came not from doubt in Eli, but from years of being taught that safety could vanish as quickly as it appeared. She approached the chief with a slow, measured stride, her chin high, her eyes shimmering with the leftover terror of the last 2 days. And Eli watched the chief's face soften in a way he hadn't expected from a man carved by responsibility and loss. The chief spoke first, his voice low and rough, offering a phrase in Apache that Eli couldn't understand but could feel, because the older girl's mouth trembled and she lowered her gaze, not in shame but in weary relief, as though the weight of the journey had finally cracked enough to let breath through. She took her little sister's hand, kissed the girl's forehead, and whispered something back. Small, steady, carrying a fierceness Eli had sensed from the moment she appeared at his gate. The ranchers shifted again, their discomfort rising like heat. But the chief turned to them with an authority that silenced the yard, his voice cool as he said, "Children ran. Children lived. And this man kept them safe. Eli didn't expect the chief to defend him, not in front of white ranchers, not in front of history, not with this much certainty. And the words hit him harder than any shout could have, steadying something inside him that he didn't realize had braced for accusation. The older sister looked at him then, truly looked, her eyes lifting toward his with a clarity that stripped away the last of her guarded distance. And she took a step closer, placing her hand over her heart in a gesture that felt far too old for someone her age, yet carried the clean sincerity of a child. She held it there for a moment, then extended her hand toward him, palm open, offering not trust fully formed but gratitude fully earned, and Eli felt his throat tighten as he answered with the same gesture, pressing his hand gently over his chest before lowering it toward her in quiet acknowledgement. The younger girl mimicked the motion sleepily in her chief's arms, her tiny hand tapping her heart before reaching toward Eli with the exhausted innocence of someone who still believed good men existed, and Eli managed a small nod. Nothing dramatic, nothing claiming. Just a soft promise that he'd remember her courage long after today. The chief studied the exchange, and something shifted in his expression. A recognition not of debt, but of kinship, in the smallest, quietest form it could take. And he stepped toward Eli with deliberate calm, before placing a hand lightly on the cowboy's forearm, a gesture rare enough that the rancher's eyes widened. "You opened your gate," the chief said simply. "You kept them warm. You kept them fed. This land is safer than most." Eli met his gaze without flinching, understanding the weight of what was being offered beneath those words. But he didn't speak. Words felt too thin for a moment that carried the shape of two cultures standing on the same patch of dirt without wariness for the first time in a long time. The chief released his arm and turned to the horses, ready to take the girls home, but before he lifted the older child into the saddle, she paused and looked back at Eli, eyes bright with something that wasn't fear or gratitude alone. It was recognition, the deep, anchoring kind that said she would remember the man who had let her sleep without listening for footsteps. She raised her hand one last time, palm open, a farewell shaped from silence and safety, and Eli mirrored it with a slow nod as dawn washed the ranch in gold, marking the moment when two frightened sisters stopped being fugitives and became part of a story larger than the fear that had carried them here. The ranch felt strangely quiet after the riders disappeared over the ridge, leaving only the slow settling of dust and the faint echo of hoofbeats fading into the morning light. And Eli stood in the yard longer than he meant to, hands on his hips, breathing in the warm smell of damp earth and hay, as though he needed to convince himself the girls were truly safe now. The barns creaked softly. The animals stirred. And the house, usually still at this hour, carried a different kind of silence. Not lonely, not hollow, but full in a way that made Eli's chest feel tight with something he didn't have a name for yet. He walked the length of the fence line out of habit, checking posts, fixing a loose wire, tying off a sagging rail, but every chore felt different than it had 2 days earlier. The ranch didn't feel like a one-man world anymore. Because every time he passed the gate, he pictured two small figures standing there, clutching hands, gathering the last of their courage to ask for safety. The memory of the older girl's hand in his lingered too, light, tremoring, full of a strength she shouldn't have had to carry alone. And for the first time in a long while, Eli realized the ranch didn't just hold his history. It now held theirs too, tucked into corners of the barn, folded into the morning quilt, written across the porch where dawn had found them afraid and exhausted. He wiped sweat from his forehead, paused near the trough, and let the moment settle into his bones. The kind of quiet that wasn't empty but earned, a stillness shaped by choices he hadn't planned to make, but would never regret. By midday, the sun warmed the boards of the porch, and Eli finally stepped inside to straighten the blankets and collect the extra cups he'd left scattered in last night's worry. He ran a calloused hand over the back of the chair where the older girl had rested for a moment before following the chief out, and something in the gesture steadied him, grounding him in the truth that sometimes protection wasn't a battle. It was simply being present when someone smaller needed a place to stop running. He opened the barn doors next, letting the sunlight spill over the hay where the girls had slept, smoothing the space into something soft and golden as he folded the quilt and placed it back on the hook by the wall, though he left it slightly rumpled because a part of him didn't want to erase their presence completely. The horses nickered as if aware of the shift in him. And Eli brushed a hand over their necks, murmuring quiet reassurances he didn't say aloud to anyone else. A breeze drifted through the open doors, carrying with it a faint, distant echo that made him step outside. The sound of children's laughter carried from far down the canyon trail, thin and playful in the wind, the kind of laughter that didn't belong to fear anymore. Eli stood still, squinting toward the ridge, knowing the girls were too far now to see, too well guarded to worry about, but close enough that he could feel the truth of what had been left behind. Trust, however small, had taken root here. He walked back to the porch, sat on the step where the older girl had kept watch during the night, and let the warmth of the day soak into him. The warmth of a morning where the ranch had stopped being just his and had become something wider, something that could hold strangers without turning them into burdens. In the quiet, he lifted his gaze toward the horizon and breathed out, slow and full, a breath that carried the shape of everything that had happened and everything that lingered. And though no one else stood with him now, the ranch no longer felt like a place meant for one man alone. It felt like a refuge, a quiet corner of the world where mercy had been offered and received, and where, if the world ever pushed frightened souls to his gate again, Eli knew with absolute certainty that he would open it without hesitation. Please like, share, and subscribe to help us tell more quiet, healing stories on Echoes of the West. If frightened children came to your door, would you stand between them and the world?